John had always believed that after decades of hard work, he had earned his slice of tranquility. In his early 60s, he and his wife, Susan, enjoyed the quiet life they had cultivated together in their suburban neighborhood. The house they had raised their children in, the garden that John meticulously maintained, and the peaceful afternoons spent on their porch sipping iced tea. This was his reward for years of tireless work. It wasn't much, but it was enough. However, it was in this very haven of serenity that an unexpected storm was about to break. It started as something small, an innocent complaint from the HOA, Homeowners Association, about his garden. John was taken aback. How could something so trivial, something he had spent hours perfecting, now become a source of contention? He brushed it off, thinking it was a one-time issue. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. He soon realized that his peaceful life was about to be upended by an unseen force, an overzealous HOA that had more power than he could have ever imagined. At first it felt like a minor nuisance, but as weeks passed, the HOA's demands escalated. What started with a simple complaint about the color of his house's shutters turned into a full-scale assault on his property. They claimed his lawn wasn't up to their acceptable standard, the position of his mailbox violated HOA code, and there were rumors spreading that the front fence was too tall. John couldn't understand how his modest home, which had always been a source of pride, was suddenly under siege. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were enforcing their personal vision of what a neighborhood should look like. They seemed determined to dictate every tiny detail of his life, from how his flowers bloomed to how his driveway was paved. As the notices piled up and the fines grew larger, John began to feel suffocated, as though he was being slowly squeezed out of a life he had worked so hard to build. He felt as if the simple joys of homeownership were slipping away from his grasp, replaced by an endless barrage of regulations and demands. Among all the faceless bureaucrats of the HOA, there was one woman who seemed to take a particular interest in John's property, Karen. She wasn't just another HOA representative. She was an enforcer, a woman who wielded her power like a badge of honor. Karen showed up at John's house day after day with a clipboard in hand, ready to point out every single flaw in his home. She scrutinized his lawn, his driveway, and his trees with a critical eye, making it clear that nothing was ever good enough. Her tone was condescending, her demeanor authoritative, and she made sure to remind John that she was just doing her job. But it quickly became apparent that Karen wasn't just following rules. She was enjoying the power trip. She would talk to him as though she were his superior, dictating what he could and couldn't do on his own property. John felt the weight of her presence, as if Karen had become the embodiment of the HOA itself, an oppressive, unseen hand that controlled everything he did. As the weeks dragged on, John began to feel trapped. Every time he turned around, there was another notice, another fine, another demand to fix something that was perfectly fine to begin with. It wasn't just about the lawn or the mailbox anymore. It was about control. It was as though the HOA and Karen were trying to strip him of his autonomy, piece by piece. John started questioning himself. Was he in the wrong? Had he really violated some obscure rule he didn't know about? Or was Karen simply making up issues because she enjoyed the power she had? He began to lose confidence, feeling small and insignificant. At the same time, he realized something deeper, that his home, his sanctuary, was no longer a place of peace, but a battleground. And it wasn't just a personal struggle anymore. It felt like his entire sense of self was being questioned by an authority that seemed to have no bounds. He had to find a way out, but how? One evening, as John sat on his porch, his neighbor Rick stopped by for a chat. Rick had always been friendly, but this time, his tone was serious. He confided in John that Karen had been spreading rumors about him, not just about his property, but about him as a person. She had gone to other neighbors, telling them that John was a troublemaker, that he was breaking all the rules, and that the HOA needed to take action. John was taken aback. He had always considered himself a good neighbor, someone who respected other space and took care of his property. But now, it seemed Karen had been using her position as a weapon against him. She wasn't just a bureaucrat. She was using her power to personally attack him, to undermine his reputation, and to turn the community against him. The revelation hit John like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just fighting for his property. He was fighting for his dignity. As the weeks wore on, the tension between John and the HOA reached a boiling point. The constant barrage of fines and complaints began to take a toll on John's mental health. He started feeling like he couldn't do anything right. Every time he fixed one issue, another would pop up. He was caught in an endless cycle, like a hamster on a wheel, spinning but never getting anywhere. One day, he received a letter from the HOA threatening to take him to court for the unsightly condition of his front yard. The letter stated that if he didn't comply, he would face not only hefty fines, but also the possibility of being kicked out of his home. The words hit him like a punch in the stomach. It felt like his world was crashing down around him. How could something as simple as his garden cause so much pain and distress? John realized that he could no longer ignore the situation. It was time to fight back, but he had no idea where to start. The fear of the unknown gripped him tightly. Late one night, while Susan was asleep, John sat alone on the porch, staring out into the darkness. He thought about everything that had brought him to this point. His hard work, his family, the life he had built. He had always prided himself on being a peaceful man, someone who avoided conflict whenever possible. But this wasn't just about a lawn or a fence anymore. This was about his home, his sanctuary, his right to live in peace. In that moment of solitude, John made a decision. He would no longer let Karen and the HOA bully him. He wasn't just fighting for his property. He was fighting for his dignity, for the life he had worked so hard to build. John realized that sometimes in life, you have to stand up for yourself, even when it feels uncomfortable. This wasn't just about avoiding conflict. It was about reclaiming control. The next day, John began to educate himself on the HOA laws and his rights as a homeowner. He pored over the HOA's rules, studied local regulations, and reached out to legal experts. He was surprised to discover that many of the complaints Karen had made were either exaggerated or outright false. The rules the HOA claimed he had violated weren't even applicable to his property, and some of the fines they had imposed were illegal. For the first time in weeks, John felt a surge of hope. Knowledge was power, and he had the tools to fight back. He spent the next few days gathering evidence, taking pictures of his property, and compiling documents. Armed with this newfound information, John knew it was time to confront Karen. This wouldn't be just another complaint. It would be a challenge to her authority. With his evidence in hand, John approached Karen at her office. He walked in calmly, his mind made up. Karen was sitting behind her desk, the same smug look on her face that she always wore when she believed she had the upper hand. But this time was different. John didn't flinch. He calmly laid out the facts, pointing out where Karen's complaints were baseless and where the HOA had overstepped its bounds. He spoke with authority, his voice steady but firm. Karen's expression shifted from confidence to irritation as she realized that John wasn't going to back down. But she still tried to maintain control, dismissing his evidence and attempting to belittle him. John wasn't having it. He reminded her that the HOA was there to serve the community, not control it. He had done his research, and he wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. Karen's facade cracked just a little. The power she once held over him was slipping away. Karen, infuriated by John's challenge, resorted to threats. She warned him that if he didn't comply with the HOA's demands, she would make sure he faced even harsher consequences. She would rally the board members, and they would make his life even more difficult. But John wasn't intimidated. In fact, her threats only solidified his resolve. He realized that she was trying to scare him into submission, but he wasn't afraid anymore. His voice grew colder as he looked her in the eye and told her that he wouldn't be bullied. Karen's face reddened with frustration, but John could see the cracks beginning to form in her armor. The reality was sinking in. She wasn't dealing with just any homeowner. She was dealing with someone who had nothing left to lose but his peace. The HOA, realizing that John wasn't going to back down, decided to escalate the situation. They took him to court, hoping to make an example out of him. The legal battle that followed was intense, but John had done his homework. Armed with evidence, he fought back with everything he had. As the case progressed, the truth began to emerge. Not only were Karen's claims about John's property baseless, but it also came to light that the HOA had been engaging in shady practices for years. They had been imposing fines on homeowners without proper justification and using their power to extort money from residents. Karen, once a symbol of the HOA's authority, found herself on the defensive. The judge ruled in John's favor, and the HOA was forced to reverse their fines and cease their harassment. It was a victory for John, but it was more than that. It was a victory for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by the HOA. As the legal battle raged on, John began to realize that he wasn't alone. More and more of his neighbors came forward, sharing their own stories of how the HOA had mistreated them. Some had been fined for trivial reasons, while others had been threatened with legal action over things they couldn't possibly control. John began to understand the full scope of the HOA's tyranny. They hadn't just targeted him, they had been terrorizing the entire neighborhood for years. With the support of his community, John's confidence grew. Together, they began to stand up against the HOA's abuse of power. The more people rallied behind him, the stronger his resolve became. The fight was no longer just his, it was a fight for the whole neighborhood. As news of John's victory spread, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to change. People who had once been afraid to speak out now began to voice their concerns. They realized that they had power too, the power to demand change and hold the HOA accountable. Karen, once a figure of authority, found herself isolated. Neighbors who had once feared the HOA now stood united against it. The HOA's grip on the community began to loosen. They could no longer bully residents into submission. The change wasn't immediate, but it was significant. The neighborhood had undergone a transformation, one that gave hope to everyone who had suffered in silence for too long. The day the judge ruled in John's favor was a day of triumph. It wasn't just a victory for John. It was a victory for every person who had ever been mistreated by the HOA. The fines were reversed, the harassment stopped, and John's property was once again his own. But more than that, the victory was a reminder of the power of resilience. John had stood up to a powerful institution, and with the support of his neighbors, he had come out on top. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the underdog can win. As John sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, he felt a sense of peace. The battle was over, but the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever. He had learned that sometimes standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's always worth it. He had learned that knowledge is power, and that even when faced with adversity, the strength of community can move mountains. Most importantly, he had learned that no one has the right to take away your peace, your home, or your dignity. It wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about reclaiming control over his life. And as he sipped his iced tea, he knew one thing for sure. He would never again let anyone take his peace for granted.